Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Outstanding Authors at Google Talk. If you look at some of our recent products that we've launched, everything from Google Earth on the moon to now Google Earth on the ocean, we have a really big focus on exploration and making information accessible to everyone. And this tradition in the oceans really got its start and got its major push with Jacques Cousteau, the famous ocean explorer. In fact, if you make a visit by the Googleplex right now, we have a temporary loan of a sculpture of Jacques Cousteau, along with other ocean pioneers. And so, we have a firm connection with the sea. And so today our talk is on the man himself, on Jacques Cousteau, his life, his family. We're joined today by Brad Matsen, who is a famed ocean author, and he'll be speaking to us about his latest book, which is all about Jacques Cousteau, Jacques Cousteau, the Sea King. So after our talk, we'll have some time for some questions and answers, so please use the mics for our YouTube audience. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Brad. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Like the rest of the world, I live with Google every day, and this is my first time in the throbbing heart of it. And it's just thrilling to see. I haven't walked around yet. It took me forever to find a place to park until I found the guy who parks the car for you, which was very good. But the business of navigating through places that no one has ever been before is your life. You do this. This is what you do, I assume, here. Someone told me this is the area where a lot of engineering goes on. You make it possible for us to push a button and we're on the moon. And now that Sylvia called your bluff on the oceans, we can look at the oceans. Jacques Cousteau was the son of a French lawyer and a wealthy woman who was the daughter of a wine grower, a grape grower who made wine near Bordeaux, France, and he was born in 1910. Traveled all over Europe with his father, who was a factotum for wealthy American expatriates. Eventually ended up in flight school where he was about to become a fighter pilot and had a car crash, which almost crippled him, and he was reassigned as a gunnery officer. This is right at the beginning of World War II. Reassigned as a gunnery officer on a cruiser near Toulon, France, where he lived with his wife. And by the late 30s, his son, Jean-Michel, his oldest son, and his son, Philippe. And Cousteau met a man named Philippe Taillez, who noticed that Cousteau was having trouble adapting to the physical therapy he was being given for the wounds that he suffered in the car crash. And Taillez says, gee, you really ought to consider going spearfishing with me. It might be a really good way to get plenty of exercise. So Cousteau started spearfishing and ran into another spear fisherman who was very famous on the Riviera at the time. And this is skin diving. They're not diving with tanks. There was no underwater breathing at this time, except for hard hat diving and some very restrictive devices that had been pioneered ever since Jules Verne wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but really a remarkable urgent need that people had to go underwater, find a way to breathe and swim free. Cousteau was obsessed with it. He was also obsessed with making movies. When he was 13 years old, he was kind of a shy kid, very mechanically inclined, built models, loved to tinker, would be in the backyard and would build a crane out of twigs, and he was just a very inventive kid. And the Pathé brothers, another technological breakthrough. I see where my mind is today because I'm here in the throbbing heart of Google. But this huge technological breakthrough of film, motion picture film. There were several wonderful breakthroughs by Georges Mel, the first person to discover that he was actually a magician, and his idea with the camera was to adapt it to use for magic tricks. And no one ever could really see where the whole thing was going, and neither could Cousteau. All Cousteau knew was that with the camera in his hand, he had personality. People liked him. And this was his entree into being an acceptable social person. Well, anyway, flashing forward again to 1943, he's on the coast there They're not starving in southern France during the German occupation, but they're not eating very well either. They're living on beans and bread and butter when they can get it, very little meat. So skin diving for fish was really important, and they live near Bandol, site of another great wine-growing region, and dove in the Mediterranean to catch fish for food. And also Cousteau was tinkering with finding a way to put a camera in a fruit jar so he could take it underwater, wind it to trigger 30 seconds of film, bring it back up, and from this he made a movie, his first underwater movie, before the invention of scuba, called 60 Feet Down. And 60 feet was about the limit that a person could get to by taking a single breath, going to 60 feet, and doing a little bit of work and getting back up and staying alive. So the goal was Cousteau and the other two men who became his best friends, and they called themselves Les Mousquetaires. They were just great buddies, and these are guys in their late 20s, you know, they're extremely vital, and so the Les Mousquetaires was obsessed with trying to experimenting with ways to breathe underwater, and they tried to breathe oxygen. They built what's called a rebreather, which is a device that, at that time anyway, you had to manually inject oxygen into the loop of the breathing loop, and the CO2 that you were exhaling was absorbed by soda lime in a canister. It was a very primitive device, and there was no way to control the amount of oxygen really that you were ingesting or breathing, and Cousteau had a high intolerance for oxygen toxicity and almost died experimenting with this. So he was fed up with using oxygen and wanted to try compressed air. Another technological wonderful breakthrough that was happening at this time was that the compression of gas, which is a marvelous transformation of physical states, basically. I wrote 10 pages on compressed gas in what one of my editors calls an expository death spiral. And it was, of course, it was cut from the book, so it isn't there, but I can tell you about it. When gas is compressed, it changes states. The simplest form is water boiling in a tea kettle. You change the temperature, all the variables. You're probably all scientists, so you know all about this. You can manipulate one variable, and it changes the state of the matter. Anyway, they had figured out how to compress gas. It was hugely important for steel making, for aviation, for carrying oxygen to higher altitudes so people could breathe when they were flying. And it was problematic because you had to contain it in extremely strong vessels that were very, very heavy. So the main company in France that was taken over by the Germans was called Air Liquide, and it just so happened that Cousteau's wife, Simone, Melchior, who he had met when he was 16 years old at a party, when he showed up at the party with his camera, a party at her mother's apartment in Paris, and took her picture. I've seen the film, and you can see her face in the camera, and she mouths her name, Simone Melchior. And you know that Cousteau, behind the camera, his beloved camera, had asked her what her name was, and she tells him. Turns out that she's the daughter and granddaughter of French Navy admirals. And her father, Henri Melchior, had retired from the Navy and was a director of Air Liquide, the company that produced compressed air tanks, and had learned the technology. I know, it all goes together, doesn't it? Really remarkable. I want to read you a little bit about the day that Cousteau got the first aqualung. He went north in 1943, December 1943, to Paris to visit his mother and to bring food, because things were really hard in the north of France. Southern France was called Vichy France. It was run by a puppet government, but it wasn't occupied by troops. Northern France, things were very bad. Cousteau's mother and some other relatives lived up there, along with his brother, Pierre-Antoine Cousteau, his only brother. He was older, and he was a Nazi collaborator. He had written several anti-Semitic books. He was the editor of a German-controlled magazine that essentially supported a vision of France as a German territory. He was also able to get Cousteau phony papers as a marine biologist so that he could travel around France, including this trip that he, Simone, and their 2 sons made north to Paris in the winter of 1943. There he met at Air Liquide an engineer named Émile Gagnon, and Émile was working like most of the scientists and engineers at Air Liquide as little as possible. They wanted to do as little as possible to help the Germans make steel, airplanes, and all of that. But for their French compatriots, they worked very hard. And one of the things Émile was working on was a demand regulator to burn methane in farm vehicles. So he had come up with basically a 2-stage regulator that when the pressure in the manifold fell to a certain point, the diaphragm would release a dose of methane, and when the pressure in the manifold rose, it would close. That's basically what a regulator is. So Cousteau went and talked to Émile Gagnon, and Émile showed him one of these regulators. In the next 3 weeks, the 2 of them came up with something that worked relatively well, attached to 3 tanks of compressed gas, 3 steel tanks of compressed gas, and Cousteau and Émile went out to the Seine and tested this device in the river. It didn't work perfectly because the exhale valve and the intake valve were at different levels, which meant that when your body was in one attitude, it would work really well. When your body was in a different attitude, it became hard to breathe. And in the opposite attitude, the tank would run free. Finally, Gagnon says he had it figured out. Cousteau goes back to Toulon, and Gagnon, a month later, sends him an aqualung fully charged with the valve in the right place. And I want to read you a little bit from the book. Can I see? Do I have to adjust? Should I adjust this somehow, or it knows what to do, right? The throbbing heart of Google. So here's Cousteau, and he's back in Toulon, and he's living communally with les Muscamers, his buddies, their wives, a couple of other people who were interested in making movies, and it was just better to be with other people during hard times, and it also meant that they could share the scavenging duties for getting food, which involved going diving skin diving until the aqualung arrived. For weeks, they had talked about the aqualung whenever the topic of conversation turned to diving. Cousteau had explained the simple mechanism of the regulator, the strength of the new steel tanks that allowed the air inside to be compressed to many atmospheres, and the intricacies of the intake and exhaust valves that would allow a diver to breathe easily in any attitude underwater. Together, they speculated that hunting fish and lobsters was going to be as easy as plucking vegetables from a stall table in the market. The interesting thing about Cousteau that struck me as I worked on this book, which began 5 years ago, was that his impulse to dive was really driven by the desire to get more food. It was a very primitive urge, and the filmmaking came second for a very long time, the thing that made him very famous. Most of all, Cousteau insisted the aqualung meant the end of experiments with dangerous gases and holding their breath to shoot film underwater. Early the following morning, before the sunbathers were out, the household trooped in pairs through the pine garden to a quiet inlet with a gently sloping beach out of sight of the sentries in the city center. Dumas carried the aqualung, but when they reached the water, he helped Cousteau into its harness and followed his instructions for double checking that the air was turned on, the tanks were secure, and the 2 hoses were firmly attached to the regulator. As the best free diver in France, Dumas would stay on shore to be ready if something went wrong. Simone, Cousteau's wife, in mask, fins, and snorkel, would swim out to watch over her husband from above and signal to Dumas if he got into trouble. Cousteau spat into his mask and rinsed it in the sea, a trick les Muscamers had learned for keeping it clear of mist. He fitted the mask tightly to his face, covered his nose and eyes to his brow, clamped the mouthpiece between his teeth, looked around for a moment at all his friends, and waddled into the water. When Cousteau was chest deep, he stopped and lay face down to gauge his buoyancy with the tanks of air on his back. He and Gagnon had designed the aqualung to be slightly buoyant in seawater because adding weight was simple and subtracting weight was impossible. Dumas waded out and cinched a belt around Cousteau with 5 pounds of lead, but it wasn't enough. He added 2 pounds more, stepped back, and watched his friend sink slowly into the crystal clear water of the Mediterranean. Cousteau breathed effortlessly, delighted by the distinctive whistle of air when he inhaled, the rippling of the bubbles over his head when he exhaled, and the snap of the regulator as it released each breath. Any scuba divers here? You know what I'm talking about. That it's so distinctive, and it still is. It's the same. Any kind of regulator you're using, it's that extremely seductive sound. It's just like the first Nikon motor drive sound. You know, it just has something really primitively seductive about the regulator. When Cousteau, let's see. Cousteau let his arms stream along his sides, fluttered his legs, and glided slowly over the sloping sand. The light danced down from the surface and flashed off the bottom until it gave way to a canyon full of dark green seagrass. Cousteau coasted to a stop. He exhaled until his lungs were nearly empty to find out what that did to his buoyancy. As expected, he sank slowly until he inhaled and began to rise toward the surface. Taking a single breath from his tanks turned him from a negatively buoyant object into a positive one. His lungs, he realized, were a sensitive ballast system. He steadied himself with his arms and swam smoothly down to about 30 feet, about 1 atmosphere. The atmosphere increases every 33 feet, 14.8 pounds at the surface, every 33 feet, another 14.8 pounds. It's really quite a pressure change even at 30 feet. Cousteau felt a squeeze in his ears and sinuses, but no other effects of the pressure and no change that he could sense in the flow of air. The regulator was operating efficiently at 2 atmospheres of pressure. Cousteau smiled into his mouthpiece as he reached the bottom of the little canyon, greeted by a flashing school of fish, round and flat as saucers. He hung on to one of the rough limestone walls and did a quick check of his equipment, patting his harness and weight belt, shrugging his shoulders to be sure the tanks were riding right, and adjusting his mouthpiece. Cousteau looked up at the surface, which was shining like a rippled mirror. Directly above him, Simone was a small silhouetted doll against the dazzling sheet of light. The doll waved at him. He waved back. Cousteau held on to his rocky anchor and studied his bubbles on their way to the surface. They swelled and flattened into mushroom shapes identical to jellyfish as they rose through the water. Since the bubbles flowed from the regulator behind his head, the water in front of him was clear, which gave him a moment of elation as he thought about eventually diving with his camera. I thought about the helmet diver arriving where I was in his ponderous boots and struggling to walk a few yards, obsessed with his umbilici and his head imprisoned in copper. Cousteau remembered about that moment. On skin dives, I had seen helmet divers lean dangerously forward to take a step, clamped in heavier pressure at the ankles than the head, a cripple in an alien land. From that day forward, we would swim across miles of country no one had ever known, free and level, with our flesh feeling what the fish scales feel. Cousteau looked again at the fish nosing curiously around him. They always returned to the horizontal from a burst up or down. Cousteau concluded, because the horizontal must be the ideal attitude for moving in a medium 800 times more dense than air, any other attitude required an expenditure of energy. Cousteau kicked and rolled through several revolutions on an axis from his head to his feet. He turned a somersault. He did a barrel roll. He remembered from flight school. He exhaled, sank headfirst to the bottom, balanced upside down on one finger, and laughed so hard he lost his mouthpiece. Taking a breath was slightly more difficult with his head straight down than in any other attitude, and Cousteau made a mental note to report that to Gagnon. He flipped upright, kicked hard, and soared upward through his own bubbles until he was just 10 feet below the surface. He swam out into deeper water and dove to 60 feet, 3 atmospheres. Nothing he did changed the steady whistle, gurgle, and snap of his breathing. The regulator worked perfectly with his body in any attitude. 3 full tanks of air would give him 60 minutes at 60 feet, Cousteau figured. He had used up 15 minutes. Despite the chill of the deeper water, he was going to stay as long as he could. He swam over familiar limestone chasms that narrowed and turned into tunnels that had terrified him as a free diver, afraid of being trapped inside with no air. Now Cousteau coasted fearlessly into one of them. The brilliant light from the surface dimmed as though it were being peeled away in layers. His tanks scraped against the rocks above him, and he felt the first twinge of claustrophobia. Cousteau's instincts for self-preservation overcame his passion to explore. He'd done enough on his first test dive. Before heading for the surface, he rolled on his back to take a look at the roof of the tunnel and saw that it was alive with lobsters. Hundreds of them were backed into niches in the limestone, their eyes glowing like fireflies in the dim light, their antennae flailing as they tried to get a fix on the giant intruder. Cousteau thought about his family and friends in ill-fed France, grabbed a pair of lobsters, backed out of the tunnel, and kicked for the surface. Simone saw him rising, swam down to him, and took their catch the rest of the way to the beach. He made 5 more trips into the lobster bonanza. Simone shuttled their catch to shore, and Jacques Cousteau became the first meat diver with the enormous advantage of being able to breathe underwater and swim like a fish. Cousteau quickly was making movies, and he ran into Louis Malle. Actually, he didn't run into him, he went after him. He went to Paris looking for a filmmaker once he had the aqualung working right. And he was in charge of the French Undersea Naval Research Group, and they had a boat and a ship, little ship actually, and then he found a way to buy Calypso, which was a converted minesweeper, that he then turned into one of the most famous boats that ever sailed. It's as famous as Endeavour or Challenger or any of the other great ocean exploration boats. The little ship called Calypso. I'm assuming that most of you have Cousteau familiarity of some kind. It's remarkable for me to have experienced thousands of people's stories about Jacques Cousteau. And when I would bring, one of the indulgences you have to have when you know writers is that the writers don't talk, they talk about the same thing all the time until they finish the book. So for 5 years I've been talking about Jacques Cousteau. I took a couple of years off and talked about Titanic for a while, but I talked about Jacques Cousteau, and people would tell me their Cousteau stories. It was like I had asked them about their operation, you know, or the death of a friend or something. You know, it was one of those topics that you tell somebody something and they always tell you something back. Cousteau became famous after making 2 films that won Oscars. One was called The Silent World, and it was really the story of learning how to dive. It was the book for it was ghostwritten by a guy named James Dugan. After that, Cousteau was chartering Calypso out to oil companies to do oil exploration, which was much more efficient with scuba diving than it was with hard hat diving. And so very ironically, very deliciously ironically, Jacques Cousteau really began as a pioneer in oil exploration 25 years before he became a famous environmentalist. He also developed what's called saturation diving, which was a way to saturate divers' bodies with nitrogen, and pioneered all of the relationships in fractional gas pressures inside bodies, along with some other people who joined him in this work. But eventually he put divers down to 400 feet, left them there for a month, and they went out and did work on dummy oil wellheads that was broadcast by primitive television into the boardrooms of oil companies to show these guys that they could put oil rigs in 400 feet of water. It was a phenomenal breakthrough, and these experiments were called Conshelf 1, 2, and 3, and he produced a film called World Without Sun that also won an Oscar. After that, a producer in Hollywood, David Wolper, who was a really remarkable fellow. There was another expository death spiral on David Wolper because he was so fascinating that didn't really make it into the book. But Wolper had made his bones as a producer by buying the first Soviet films of Laika, the dog that the Soviets shot into space in the late 50s, and turning it into a sensational documentary which the networks wouldn't buy, and Wolper said, "Oh, the hell with you," and he started his own network, went around to all the little stations around the country, broadcast his documentary, and finally ABC News, which was controlling ABC at the time said, "Oh well, we'll let you show some documentaries on our station." Hard to believe. When you look at the new technologies, I always, like yours, I always think, we really don't know where this is going. And like television was never perceived as a medium for selling advertising. It was perceived as a public service to dispense news. That was the main impulse of television, of broadcast television. So they didn't want to do documentaries which they considered to be flawed, corrupt by music, storyline, setup scenes, and things like that. Anyway, Wolper broke through. He saw a Cousteau documentary that had been produced for National Geographic on a Red Sea trip that Cousteau took for oil exploration. And with his wife and sitting in their living room, he said, the television looks like an aquarium. People would love this. So he goes to Monaco and he makes a deal with Cousteau. And he goes down to look at Calypso. And Calypso is just a hard-working little research ship at this point. And Wolper says, this thing looks terrible. You're going to have to paint it. I don't want divers in black costumes. I want divers in silver costumes with yellow helmets. I want And so Wolper turns Cousteau into a television star for a series that he sells to ABC, kind of another marvelous expository death spiral on how that happened. But it becomes the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau, which is what most people remember about their childhoods, at least people of my generation, remember about their childhoods looking across a turkey TV dinner watching Jacques Cousteau underwater. So he does this for 10 years. Then he moves on, he does some, this is when he becomes an environmentalist. He's founded the Cousteau Society, which is the fastest growing environmental organization in the world because he can't stand what he sees happening to the Mediterranean Sea. Moves into PBS, does a dozen really on-the-nose documentaries showing ocean deterioration, which were very unpopular. Nobody wanted to see them, in spite of the fact that he had 300,000 members of the Cousteau Society. Environmentalism was becoming a cause célèbre in our culture, but people still did not want to watch that for entertainment. PBS canceled him after the series, which incidentally was funded by ARCO. The PBS series was funded by ARCO. A lot of irony in this book, or in this story. And he went on the recommendation of John Denver to meet Ted Turner. And Turner and Cousteau, the only one missing in that meeting was P.T. Barnum. The two of the greatest showmen in American history met in Atlanta, and Turner wrote him a blank check, basically. And he produced 42 documentaries for cable. So Cousteau had moved from home movies to Oscar-winning films, to broadcast television, public television, and finally into cable television. I'm going to save the rest of the story for the book. You can read it. Cousteau's life turned sour in about 1979. His son was killed. He had started a second family without telling the first family that he had a second family. It created a terrible rift when his first wife, Simone, finally died, and he married his mistress, with whom he already had 2 children, and then made her the heir to everything that he had done. I know that you have Jennifer was telling me you have a layer. I apologize, I haven't explored this yet, but I will for sure. A layer coming from the Cousteau Society, but they are now the possessor of all of the material that Jacques Cousteau produced, so that's where you want to go to get it. His son, Jean-Michel, runs something called the Ocean Future Society, which is now also producing television documentaries, and they helped me an awful lot with the book, along with Fabien Cousteau, who I think has been here, Jennifer. So that's the Cousteau family. It's been a very interesting 5 years for me, and it's a pleasure to share the book with you. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. So, any questions or Cousteau stories? Anybody got a Cousteau story? Yeah. No. Yeah, sure. The technical details of the first regulator. I believe the 3 tanks were at 300 psi, and the regulator staged it down to 14.8, coming through in 2 stages. There are footnotes in the book relating to this. I got my advice on this from someone you enshrined in your Hall of the Ocean here recently, Phil Newton. I don't know if anybody had a chance to meet that remarkable guy, but he's a pretty amazing person, and he was my guru for explaining how all this works. I mean, just the business of breathing, you know, it's purely mechanical. It's a purely mechanical thing, so when you're designing a regulator, all you're doing is really kind of recreating your diaphragm. That's what it is. You reduce the pressure on this thing and it reacts a certain way. That's how we breathe. So by pressure reducing and rising and falling. Yes?
What was your interest in writing this story?
I had just, this 5 years ago, I had finished a book that was fairly successful on William Beebe and Otis Barton. Anybody ever heard of them? The book is called Descent, The Heroic Discovery of the Abyss. These were two ocean pioneers who had themselves sealed into a 4.5-foot steel ball with two 4-inch silicon glass portholes and lowered to a half-mile into the ocean off Bermuda. And they were the first human beings to descend beyond sunlight. Anyway, I had just written that book, and I was sitting around my apartment in New York with my girlfriend one day, and I was saying, geez, Meryl, you know, I haven't the slightest idea what I do for an encore with this. She said, how about Cousteau? And I was shocked to find that no one had done it yet. There were two biographies written in the mid-'80s. One was kind of a hatchet job. Somebody really didn't like Jacques Cousteau and wanted to make his family feel bad about him, I guess, I don't know. And the other was the sort of a celebrity biography by a man named Axel Matsen. But it only took Cousteau up to 1985. He died in 97. I just lost it. We good? We're good? Ah, there we are. You couldn't have a technological breakdown here, could you? So yeah, that's how I got into it. The first thing I did is I said maybe. You know how the wisdom of that, right? I mean, before you get involved in something that's going to occupy your life for 2 to 5 years, you say maybe. And when I was saying maybe, I went to France. I said, I want to go look at where this guy was born. I want to find Calypso. I had no idea where Calypso was. So I went to his village in Saint-André-de-Cubzac, saw his grave, I saw the place he was born. I went on the train north a couple of hours to La Rochelle, where I heard Calypso was, and I found Calypso, and she was sitting there rotting at a dock, held together by canvas straps. And when I saw Cousteau's grave and I saw his birthplace and all, it wasn't quite enough to, I had one foot in the story then. But when I saw Calypso, I thought, oh, you know, something's not right here. And to me, as a journalist, as a writer, that's what I was looking for in a story. So it was really seeing Calypso rotting at the dock, which incidentally, Francine, Cousteau's widow, who inherited everything, was in a 10-year legal battle with Jean-Michel for control of Calypso. Now, Calypso is being renovated at a shipyard in Brittany with a grant from Carnival Cruise Lines, of all people. And supposedly will sail next spring again. Knock on wood. It'd be wonderful if it happened. So, yes.
Question. When you were reading about the first dive, I've never had a happy ending, but I've done a lot of scuba diving. But if I remember right, 5 dives a day to 60 feet, you're flirting with bends or dead things. Is that
The question.
they know what they were doing?
The question was, did Cousteau and his Les Mousquetaires and the others have any idea at the time what they were doing when they were diving to several atmospheres? The answer is no. And in fact, they made their first film about a shipwreck, and their first dive, during which they spent more than 20 minutes on the bottom, was to 130 feet. And they were taking grave risk. Haldane, I don't know, Haldane was the fellow who pioneered the real understandings for hard hat divers and for people who worked in bridge caissons. Anybody who was working under pressure was susceptible to the bends. So there had been some research on this, and they had primitive dive tables, but Cousteau refined them. He and the others who worked with him. Cousteau had his genius really was for getting other people to do things for him. I think, you know, that's probably the pattern of innovative people who bring technological breakthroughs to the world. They figure out how to get people to realize their vision, and he was a genius at that. So, yes?
Did they use the dive tables from the caissons and the data in their initial stuff, or was it just that soon they decided they should?
The question was, did they use the dive tables in caissons and in early diving? The answer is yes. They did it the best they could. The real caisson disease, or the bends, first came to be a real problem when they were building the Brooklyn Bridge. Incidentally, marvelous book on the building of that bridge by David McCulloch, if anybody is just wants to pick up a 600-page book and read it. But and it tells a lot about how men were coming out dying and bent, and they could only function again when they went down. And the original work on figuring out what was causing the bends was done on goats. And later on, actually, the goat was physiologically similar enough to the human body, so that's the test animal that they used.
Did Cousteau use that data on his initial dives, or was he? He was an inquisitor, but mostly Taillez was. Philippe Taillez was. Taillez did, as far as I could figure, he did most of the library work for Cousteau. He was the one who came up with Haldane's tables, and of course, like every new technology, it proceeded at breakneck speed once they made the first discovery of using the aqualung. So within the first 6 months, they had some good dive tables assembled. They really understood what was going on. And they had also lost a diver. 6 months after the first dives, they lost a diver at the underwater research, in the underwater research group. So they started realizing how dangerous this thing was. And they were also doing things like trying to find out how deep they could go without knowing, and which is when they lost the diver. They would go down a rope holding onto weights and hang a slate at the greatest depth and try to get back up. Very risky. Again, Cousteau didn't do a lot of this himself. He had a chronic ear problem, a chronic ear squeeze problem. Anybody else? Yes. Yeah, he renounced it except for the chef on Calypso. The chef could spearfish when they were on expeditions. During the filming of The Silent World and the earliest episodes of the Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau, the 2 films and the first television series, Cousteau was on the ship a lot. After that, he wasn't on it very much. So a lot of spearfishing did go on. His objections to spearfishing were essentially those that he felt for overfishing in general, which, as is often the case, it took the really sensational revelation of what was happening to tuna in the Mediterranean, which was a real disaster as far back as the 60s. And Cousteau observed that. And his environmental sensibilities gradually crept up on him, but were primarily motivated by what he saw as a young man in the early 40s when they were skin diving, and what he saw in the Mediterranean just 10 years later from pollution, runoff, and overfishing. So, well, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.